Hey guys, I'm Brittany from Quarter Acre Roots, where we talk about growing a lot on a little bit of space, and today we are talking about dill. There are so many reasons to grow dill beyond just like using it to make pickles and using it for other stuff in the kitchen. So even if you don't cook much or you don't cook with it, definitely keep watching because I think I'm gonna convince you to put dill into every little empty spot around your garden. Dill is definitely one of the easiest herbs to grow, and it's a fantastic plant for pollinators. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the video when we talk about the fact that it is also a great host plant for the black swallowtail butterfly. So I'm going to show you guys how and where I grow dill, how it reseeds itself all over my garden so I don't even really have to plant it many times year to year, how I save seeds for future years, and what I do when I end up with way more dill than I know what to do with. So first off, dill is an annual herb in the garden, and that means that you plant it every year and it finishes its life cycle every year. So you start it with a seed and it finishes the season, completing its life cycle, going to seeds to start everything over again. So some of the dill I have in my garden right now might not look exactly what you think dill will look like, but that's because we are in like mid to late July here in Maryland Zone 7A, and a lot of my dill is finishing the process of flowering and going to seed. So I'll show you guys what it looks like every step of the way. Here's one of my biggest dill plants. This is one that I actually did start off by winter sowing, and I just plucked up a little seedling and put it here in the ground, and it took off like crazy. Dill prefers full sun, and this is definitely an area that gets full sun. Lots of light here. It can do a little bit of partial sun as well, but it may not be as prolific and get as big and lush as this beauty is. So you can see that dill can add a lot of structural interest in your garden beyond just like being something that you harvest for those dill leaves. Like these right here. These are wonderful. I have harvested a ton from my plants already, but once they start flowering and going to seed, they stop producing that foliage, but I generally just kind of let them complete their life cycle because they look really pretty in the garden. And even though I said I did transplant this one, you only really want to transplant dill when it's really, really small seedling because they can develop pretty long tap roots. So if the plant gets too mature, you might disturb that tap root when you dig it up and plant it somewhere else. So you either want to be transplanting teeny tiny seedlings, or you want to be direct sowing it in place by just sprinkling a bunch of seeds and then thinning out the little plants when you get too many germinating in one area. And honestly, I found that dill is like one of those herbs that it does the best when you kind of ignore it. Like, it doesn't need super great soil. It does not need anything special to thrive. It doesn't need fertilizer. It doesn't need any of that. It's just gonna pop up everywhere in your garden where you sprinkle seeds as long as it gets enough sun. You do want to water your dill plants when they're getting established, but once they develop that pretty long taproot and they become a little bit more mature, they're pretty drought tolerant. So all my dill plants in the ground, like, I never water them at all. Like, I let Mother Nature water them when it rains, but I never go over with the watering can when we have long periods of drought or super hot weather, and they've done amazing. Even when we had like a week and a half straight of like 90 to 100-degree temperatures and no rain at all, they did awesome. The plants that I have in my raised beds do get watered by my irrigation, but a lot of times they're on the edges of the raised beds, like the one I'm about to show you in a second in my tomato bed. So they're getting water and moisture from the soil, but they're not getting like any sort of deep watering. Here is a dill plant, and I don't know if you can see this little grasshopper on this dill flower that's going to seed here, but we are going to tell you about this plant now. So this one is nearing the very end of its life cycle. So you can see it has a very tall stalk going up without much foliage, just a couple little areas that I might pull off. But this one is on the edge of one of my tomato beds, and I like planting dill on the edges of my raised vegetable beds because it can kind of like grow over the edge like this, and it doesn't take up much space in the actual bed. If you have your dill planted in raised beds that you are fertilizing, you should definitely be aware that sometimes over fertilizing or even regular fertilizing of your herbs can dull the taste. That's because the excess nitrogen in a lot of fertilizers are going to encourage a lot of leafy growth, but then they might not taste as strong as they would have if you hadn't have used fertilizer. So just something to think about if you have them in your raised beds where you are fertilizing things. I generally do not fertilize. I use like a liquid seaweed plant supplement every like maybe month or so throughout the growing season, and I top off with fresh leaf compost in my growing areas at the beginning of the year. So it's not really something I worry too much about, and I have plenty of dill, so if I find that the taste is off, I'll just take from another plant. Okay, so I have cut some little pieces of some of my dill flowers to illustrate to you guys why this plant is such a great plant for pollinators. Now, a lot of people will grow dill and snip off the flowers as they start to emerge to prevent it from bolting and flowering and going to seed. And that's perfectly valid if you want to be growing it for dill and you want the plant to continue focusing its energy on producing that leafy foliage. However, you're kind of just slowing down the inevitable. So what I always recommend people do is scatter dill seeds every couple of weeks throughout the season so that you always have plants at different stages of maturity. Then when your plants start showing signs of wanting to finish their life cycle and flower and go to seed, you can just let them, because you know that you're going to be able to harvest dill from other plants that are like a couple weeks behind them. So when your dill starts flowering, I pulled this from one of my plants. Now, I don't have a really great example of dill flowers here. If I can find a good picture of one, I'll throw it up as well. So I pulled this, it's got these little umbel shapes of a bunch of tiny different flowers. And what I did was I pulled a bigger cluster here from a bronze fennel that gives you a better idea of what it looks like when it's in full bloom. Fennel and dill are very, very similar in how they grow, how they flower, how they go to seed. The bronze fennel is just much larger than the dill I have, and I find that it continues producing for a little bit longer than the dill does. So also makes a great alternative if you want those similar pollinator benefits for these clustered umbels of flowers. So you're gonna see everything visiting these clusters of flowers because there's just so much easy to access nectar in all of these tiny little flowers on these umbels. You're gonna see native bees, you're gonna see ladybugs, you're gonna see hoverflies, you're gonna see parasitic wasps, all of the things that you want to be inviting into your garden to help you take care of the bad bugs. Because you want to be creating an ecosystem in your garden. You don't want your garden to just have only good bugs or no bugs at all, because neither of those things are possible. If your garden is functioning in the right way, then you've got plenty of plants like flowering dill and fennel to be helping to attract lots of beneficial insects to help you control pest populations that you don't want on your vegetables. Dill is also a super common host plant for black swallowtail caterpillars. So if you've ever grown dill or anything like in the carrot family, including fennel, including rue, parsley, carrots, celery, all of those things, you've probably at some point encountered a really bold looking, like black, greenish, yellowish striped caterpillar on it. And they start off really small, but they eat a lot and they get big and chunky really fast. These are the caterpillars for black swallowtail butterflies. So you definitely want to plant enough of all of these plants to share. If you don't want to give up your dill because you want to be harvesting that dill for your own garden or for your own needs, what you can do is you can grow something like parsley, which I find has like leafy parts for much longer throughout the season. And if you find those caterpillars on your dill, you can just move them over to your parsley. But honestly, I find that's a lot of work. And if something decides to move in and lay eggs on one of my plants because a mama butterfly decides this is the perfect place to lay my eggs, I'm gonna trust that she knows what she's doing and that she thinks that's the best place in the yard. So I try to grow enough dill to share with them and to use for myself, because I find that they really like the dill. Like, I find that dill is what they're on the most, and then I find that they like the fennel as well. My parsley, they don't seem to like as much. Later on in the season, I'll find them a little bit more on the parsley, but usually that's probably because a lot of my dill and my fennel has then completely gone to seed and I've lost a lot of that foliage that the caterpillars want, so they are then migrating to the parsley, which is still really leafy until later in the season. So when you see those caterpillars, they're not bad bugs, they're good bugs. You just have to share with them. You just have to plant enough to share. They're wonderful, beautiful caterpillars and butterflies, and it's super fun to watch them eat every day and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then they will form the little chrysalises and then emerge as butterflies. So let's get back to our flowers here and how the dill completes its life cycle to reseed itself. So when you have a flower like this, it's gonna look like this for a little while. The pollinators are gonna enjoy it, and then eventually you're going to notice those flowers starting to fade and turning into what kind of look like little green pointy ovals. These are the beginnings of what will eventually be your seeds. You don't want to harvest these yet because they're not ready to go, they're not viable, they have not completed their life cycle. Just let them chill on the plant to finish things off. I generally find that when they reach this point, it's probably like maybe another week before they start really browning and turning into the seeds that you can save or just kind of let scatter around the plant to reseed themselves. So when they are brown, completely brown and brittle, and when you can go just like this and pull a bunch off into your hands. I just dropped the bunch into my green stalk here, so we'll probably get some volunteer dill. That's when it's time to save them. So on a large dill plant, you can imagine it can produce hundreds of seeds from just one plant. So if you do not deadhead that plant when it finishes flowering and going to seed, and you just let that dill kind of fly everywhere, all of those seeds, you're gonna get volunteers popping up next year. And like I said, if you don't like where they volunteer themselves, you can watch, and when they're like really small little dill plants, you can dig them up and transfer them, but don't wait too long because of that deep taproot. You don't want them to get too comfortable. Now, if you are a control freak, like I kind of am sometimes in the garden, and you don't want the dill reseeding itself everywhere, but you want a continuous supply of dill, here's what I like to do. I like to just take these flowers, I like to wait for them to get nice and brown, and then I like to pick off the seeds, and then I like to go over to the edges of my garden beds and just sprinkle them in. That's all I do, just sprinkle them in. So throughout the summer, I know that I'm going to have dill popping up all over the garden. You can also take the seeds and sprinkle them in specific parts of your garden. If you don't want the wind to choose for you or the birds to choose for you, you can sprinkle them in certain parts. Or what I do a lot of times is you take off these seeds, get as many as you can onto your hand here, and then I would lay them out on a paper towel and put them in a windowsill to dry before you store them over the winter, because you can store them and just direct sow them next year, or start them or winter sow them or whatever. You can certainly save them to store. You just want to make sure they're completely brown and brittle and that they're completely dry before you store them. So even if they seem super dry and it's been a super dry day, I like to sprinkle them over a paper towel with clean hands and then let them kind of dry off in the windowsill a little bit more, just to make super sure. One of my absolute delights earlier this spring was I planted a bunch of onions, bulbing onions, in a covered bed. So I had like a mesh cover over it to try and deter the allium leaf miners. Well, what I didn't realize was that my dill had reseeded itself all in that bed last year. I kind of just let it do its thing. And since I wasn't checking on this bed much, I wasn't opening it up and looking much, the dill really took off. And then at one point, like I think it was in like early May, I went and I thought I should actually go like fertilize those onions and check on them instead of just like letting Mother Nature take its course. I opened it and there was so much dill. It was huge, it was healthy. I could not believe how much dill there was in there. So I started harvesting the dill and chopping down the flowers so I could get more dill, because I knew that having the flowers in there wasn't that helpful, because I still had the bed covered with that insect netting. So no beneficial bugs were going to be attracted to it. I was just cutting it back to harvest more and more dill. Now, what I did with all of that dill was I took it inside and I chopped it down to like usable portions. I washed it and dried it in one of those salad spinners so I could get as much moisture off of it as possible. And then I just shoved it into freezer bags and I froze it. And I've been taking chunks of dill out to use for things like I just made fridge pickles yesterday, and I didn't have much fresh dill on hand right now since most of my dill plants are going to seed. So I just grabbed a chunk of frozen dill. I do find that dill kind of loses its flavor and a little bit of like its strong scent if you dehydrate it, though dehydrating is certainly a great example of a way that you can preserve too much dill if you don't have a lot of freezer space. I just really wanted to devote one bag to the freezer dill because I could just grab a handful of that fresh dill and shove it frozen right into my pickle jar and let it do its dill job. So if you're new to growing a lot of herbs and you don't do like a lot of cooking or preserving like I didn't do when I first got started gardening, you may have gone into this video thinking like, oh, I don't really like pickles. I don't want to make pickles. I don't do that much cooking with dill. Why should I grow dill? Dill has so many benefits beyond just the things that you can do to cook and preserve with it. And let me tell you what, when you have a plethora of dill, you start to learn how to use it. Like there's been nothing better for my creativity in cooking and like learning the things that I like to do and cook in the kitchen, because I traditionally do not like cooking at all. There's been nothing better for that than having to learn how to use the things that I'm growing myself, because I don't want it to go to waste. So beyond the kitchen benefits, obviously it is a beautiful plant. The umbels of flowers and how tall and stately it can get just look really, really pretty in a garden. It's an awesome annual choice to fill out areas between perennials that are coming in, or to just fill out areas that you hold space for like annuals every year, because this is a really beneficial annual to have. It's not like some of the prettier annuals that I just like to slot in because I like the way that they look, which is perfectly valid to do that in your own garden. But the dill is something that I love the way it looks, and it also gives me a lot of benefits because again, those big clusters of yellow flowers just do an amazing job at attracting lots of beneficial bugs that then once they come into our garden, they realize there's a lot of yucky bugs and bad stuff that we don't want that they can snack on, and that is exactly what we want our garden to become. And it's also a host for the black swallowtail butterfly, so if you want more beautiful butterflies in your garden and you want to watch the process of caterpillars, putting dill in your garden is going to be like the #1 thing you can do to attract them. And then if you're just kind of a lazy and cheap gardener like I tend to be sometimes, and you don't want to buy new seeds every year, dill is one of those plants that you have to buy it once and you never have to buy it again. You let it go to seed, one plant can create hundreds of seeds. I have so many dill seeds that I have saved over the years. I could not give away all of my dill seeds because I don't know enough people who have big enough gardens for all the dill seeds I have. So I have just started sprinkling them all around my garden because I know it's gonna have a lot of value even if I'm not using the dill. So I hope this convinced you guys the value of adding dill to your garden. I wanna do some more videos like this where we talk about like specific plants and why I love growing them every year, what the benefits are of them beyond just like what the obvious benefits might be. There's so much more about so many plants that most people don't realize how they kind of function and work in your overall garden. So let this be the first of many videos. Let dill be the first to convince you of plants that you should add to your garden. So until my next video, happy planting.